Welcome back. So we just finished off with comments. Comments are not executed by the Python editor. We're going to look at numbers now, and numbers come in different types. So for example, we have the normal counting numbers 1, 2, 3, and they can also be minus numbers. Let me just copy this into Notepad here. So we'll just erase what we have. And we have our normal counting numbers that we learn about as children, and we can also have the minus numbers as well. So those are called integers. So that's the first type of numbers that we need to be aware of in Python. The other type of numbers we use in Python, well, we use a lot of different types, but there's also what are called floats. Float is just a fancy way of saying there's a decimal in there. Now notice here, 10 point, there's nothing after that point, so it's automatically going to be understood by Python as a floating number or floating point number. If you take out that decimal, then it's no longer a floating point decimal, it is now an integer. So you do, at a very minimum, need to have that decimal in there, and if that bothers you, put 10.0, put the 0 after it. Maybe it's a little bit easier to understand when you're looking at. So those are the kind of numbers that we work with. Now in this particular assignment, in the instructions, what we're going to do is we're going to go shopping and we're going to buy cucumbers. So let's go ahead and create a variable for cucumbers. My code editor isn't loaded, so let me just reload the page. Okay, so it's working now, so I'm going to paste in cucumbers there, and it says just make it a number 1 or greater. So let's say 2 cucumbers, and let's click run. Okay, so we've now put the number 2, which is an integer, inside the cucumbers variable. Now each cucumber costs 3.25 doubloons or dollars or whatever you want to call these, are expensive cucumbers, and that is not an integer, that is a floating point decimal, or a float for short. So let's go ahead and create a variable for that. So equals 3, and the second you put that point in, that decimal, it's no longer an integer, that is now a float. So we go ahead and run that, so it gets registered, and the next question is enabled. Now we want to create a total. Okay, what we're going to do, we're buying 2 cucumbers, and each cucumber is 3.25, so we have to multiply those together and put it in a variable called total cost. So let's double click on total cost, copy, and then we'll paste that in, equals the 2 variables multiplied together, so cucumbers. Welcome back. So we just finished comments. We're going to look at numbers and the different types of numbers that Python understands. So for example, if we take a look at these numbers over here, these are our normal counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, and they can also be minus as well. So we call those numbers integers. The other types of numbers that we're going to look at in this section have a decimal in them. So if we take a look at these ones here, these are decimal numbers. We refer to these as floating point numbers or just floats. Now look at this one here. This looks a little bit strange. 10 point. That point means it's not an integer. It's a floating point. So if that bothers you, you can just do a 0.0 so it looks a little bit more natural. to you. But the second you remove that dot, it's no longer a floating point, it becomes an integer. So let's take a look at what we have to do here. So we have to define the number of cucumbers we're going to purchase. So we're going to purchase at least 2 cucumbers. So that's an integer. So I'm just going to do a 2, not a 2.0. And how much do these cucumbers cost? Well, those cucumbers, they cost 3.25 doubloons, whatever a doubloon is, or dollars. So let's go ahead and enter that in the new variable. Price per cucumbers equals 3.25. That is a float automatically because of that point. And now we want the total cost, and that total cost is the 2 multiplied together. So let's go ahead and put that in there, total cost. So it is the cucumbers multiplies with a star, price per cucumber. And hopefully I didn't make any mistakes there. Now, before I click run, a question comes up. We have an integer being multiplied by a float. What is the result going to be? The result is going to be, it's going to be a float. It's going to go to the more general or larger group, and we have more floating numbers, more decimal numbers than we have integers. So it will automatically, we call this typecasting, it will change type and the final result will be a float. So let's go ahead, click run to make sure we did it correctly. And nope, something is wrong. So I probably wrote the name of the variables wrong. And the way I know this, I'm reading right here. Okay, I see line 5. Line 5 is where I'm defining everything. So let's do this again to make sure we did it right. But this time, instead of typing it out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do copy and paste. So let me get rid of my previous variables and then price per cucumber. Let's do a copy. And then we'll remove price per cucumber. And this time, when we run it, we get the result. Now, we said that this is going to be a float, okay, but let's convince ourselves that it is a float. Let's go ahead and print this out. So we're going to do a print. We put our brackets in there, double click on total cost, copy, put that in there. And let's go ahead and run, and we can see the total cost. And indeed, 2 times 3.25 is 6.5. Now, I think that is about it for this assignment. Now let's go ahead and click next. Okay, now we're going to look at 2 types of divisions. Okay, one type of division will give us an integer number, and the other type of division will give us a float. And it really depends on how we do it. Okay, so let's look at some examples here. Okay, so I'm going to do a copy and paste of some examples. Okay, so here you could see 7 point divided by 2. So that is going to give us a float. If I get rid of that, you might be surprised by the result. It's 3.5. That's the real answer. But because there's no point in here, Python will automatically take that out. So if I want to force it to take the decimal point, I have to put a point with a 7, or a point with a 2, or a point with both of them. Okay, so if you have an integer divided by an integer, the result will be an integer, and the only way you can get a float result is if one of the numbers or the other or both are also decimal numbers. And this could bother some people looking at it. If it bothers you, do 7.0 divided by 2.0. It looks a little bit more natural, and that's perfectly fine. So let's go ahead and do the example. So in number 1, we have a variable called cucumbers. Okay. And how many cucumbers do we have? Well, we're going crazy now. Now we have 100 cucumbers, and we have 6 people. So create a variable, 6 people. Okay, and let's go ahead and run that. So that was successfully declared. And now we want the number of whole cucumbers. So we're going to divide one by the other, okay? And that is not going to give us a floating point. It's not going to give us a decimal. It's just going to give us the part without the decimal. So let's go ahead and take cucumbers, and we're going to divide cucumbers by the number of people. Oops, let's do that again. So number of people, right click, copy. And when we click run, it enables the next question. But I'm not going to go to the next question. I want to convince you that this is an integer, not a decimal. So 10 divided by 6 is definitely not an integer. It is a decimal. It is a float, or it should be a float. So let's go ahead and print this out, and you will see that Python doesn't treat this like a float. It treats it like an integer because we haven't told it yet that it's a float. So let's go ahead and run this, and we can see the result is 16. What it did was it cut off the decimal portion and just gave us the integer part only. Now let's go on to the next part, and now we're going to do the same kind of division again, but we're going to change one or the other to a float. So we have a new variable now. Okay, we're going to divide the exact same thing again. So let's highlight it. However, one or the other parts has to be a float, either cucumbers or number of people. So just choose one or the other or both. I'm going to choose the first one. And the way I change that into a float is with the float method. Okay, so I just put cucumbers in brackets, and I put the word float there, and that converts it automatically to a float. So instead of 100, it's going to be 100.0 divided by the number of people, 6, and it's going to give us the result this time. So let's click run to make sure I did it correctly. I did it correctly, and let's see if we can print out that result. So we're going to print, and I'm going to double click on that variable, come down here, start some brackets, Control V, and let's see the result. So last time we got 16, now we get 16.666, and it is now treating it as a float or decimal number instead of a whole number or integer.